Greetings. PSI, Public Services International, with the support of the National Education Organization of the German Trade Union Confederation, DGB, have previously shared 2 videos that presented important tools for us to occupy international spaces that can be used in our fight against the aggressive repression, intolerance, and hate that is spreading throughout many countries in the intra-American region. The 2 guides that were previously presented are the Practical Guide to Trade Union Action at the International Labor Organization and the Practical Guide for Trade Union Action in the Inter-American Human Rights System. Today, PSI innovates once again with our launch of the Practical Guide to Union Action, International Instruments for the Defense of Human Rights, a guide to strengthen organized actions at the local, national, and global level. Among the 3 guides, this one is the most complex because unlike the ILO and the Inter-American Human Rights System, this guide includes strategies to be used in spaces that are more deeply connected to capital's interests. But let's take a closer look because that's what our fight requires. With this guide, we highlight 7 more distinct instruments. Starting with the Universal System of Human Rights of the United Nations. Based on the Universal Human Rights Declaration and on international human rights treaties adopted by the United Nations, the Universal System is composed of conventional and non-conventional mechanisms created to monitor compliance with international obligations. The specific ways in which trade unions can use these mechanisms are detailed in the guide. Another instrument is the Monitoring System for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Approved by the United Nations in 2015, Agenda 2030 defines 17 objectives for sustainable development, the SDGs, including specific objectives on work. All of the SDGs contain specific goals and measures that can be monitored by trade unions. Through the Union Cooperation Network for Development of the International Trade Union Confederation, unions are involved in the 2030 Agenda process, monitoring compliance, including, for example, by publishing parallel union reports. Next, the System for the Promotion and Implementation of the Organization for Cooperation in Economic Development, the OECD's. Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. The Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises adopted by the OECD are recommendations made by governments about the conduct of multinational companies in all of their activities and operations, wherever they occur, including throughout global value or production chains. In cases where violations of the recommendations occur, trade unions can register and follow up on formal complaints with national contact points. The 4th instrument, Global Framework Agreements. GFAs are agreements negotiated between global unions and multinational companies with the objective of recognizing and guaranteeing workers' rights globally, throughout production chains. GFAs often apply to suppliers and subcontractors, as well as the company that has signed the agreement. Labor chapters in free trade agreements provide a set of mechanisms whereby the signatory parties, in this case governments, recognize their commitment to guaranteeing minimum labor standards as defined and agreed to at the ILO. Violations of these standards can lead to the creation of arbitrations panels, which may ultimately result in the suspension of benefits ceded in the free trade agreement itself. Labor safeguards of the multilateral development banks. International trade union action resulted in the creation of mechanisms and compliant procedures to guarantee respect for and protection of fundamental labor standards at the international finance institutions, banks that loan billions to governments and companies to finance investment projects. Lastly, but no less importantly, the International Criminal System for Crimes Against Humanity and Genocide. Crimes against humanity and genocide are understood in the international community to be serious aberrations that should be reported and denounced at any time in specific courts dedicated to these problems, including by trade unions. With this brief description of these 7 instruments, we want to reconfirm that the purpose of the Practical Guide to Trade Union Action International Human Rights Instruments is to understand and use this wide variety of tools to defend and expand the effective respect for human and labor rights around the world. It's time for us to deepen our unity. This guide presents international instruments that can be used by trade unions occupying all available spaces in the fight for respect for rights. We must also reaffirm that none of these strategies work without intense mobilization and organization. The fight of each and every one of us is irreplaceable. PSI, with the support of the DGB, is demonstrating who we are and how we make a difference in the struggle to guarantee respect for labor, union, and human rights.